It's getting very late at night in Zurich. I just went back to the studio with my backpack here. And in my backpack I have something special, which you can already guess from the title of this video, wrapped into some protective plastic here. And before we open that, I should say thank you very much to my friends from the Leica store in Zurich who gave this to me today for a very quick first look overnight, and then I'll get it back again over the weekend when the store is closed to do a more comprehensive review. But let's have a look. This is Drums and Whistles, the brand new, just announced today, Leica SL2-S. And it's the newest camera in the family of system cameras from Leica, full frame sensor, 24 megapixels. I come to all of that in the course of the video. What I want to do tonight is, given that it is late, not a shooting of course, but a first view, a first look at this new camera, a tiny little bit of a comparison between the Leica SL2 and the Leica SL2-S, and just first impressions. Let's kick off the video. I just realized that when I came in, I even forgot to take off my jacket, which I have done by now. So I'm ready now to have a first look at the new Leica SL2-S. S clearly stands for speed, and we'll come to that in the course of the video. And the first distinction attribute between the Leica SL2 and the Leica SL2 Speed is the Leica lettering here. And on the SL2 it's in white, and on the SL2-S it's actually in black, and it looks very fancy. If you look at that, it looks really cool. So that's a nice design feature which at the first view distinguishes immediately the SL2-S from the Leica SL2. If you look at the dimension of the two cameras, they are exactly the same. So there is no difference here between these two cameras. Everything is the same. The design of the body, the elements and the buttons, everything is exactly the same. The mechanism for the battery here is the same. So if you push that button, it cannot drop off. If you give it another push, it drops off. So that's all exactly the same. From the exterior, there are no differences here. And by the way, those of you who are interested, on my Leica SL2, currently I have a Sigma lens here, 45mm, widest open aperture is 2.8, and it's a very small, very compact, lightweight lens here. And I'm going to test this out in the next 2 or 3 weeks, because this lens here is super cheap if you compare it to typical Leica SL lenses. This is only $400, and so far from my first shooting experience, it's a very promising lens, very solid build. So stay tuned on my channel. You will get that review in the next couple of weeks. So what distinguishes then these two cameras? What are the main distinction attributes, and why should you decide for the Leica SL2 or for the Leica SL2 Speed? And one thing is clear: if you are someone who is after video, a videographer, someone who shoots maybe videos more frequently than photos, then the SL2 Speed is a very interesting value proposition for you. Let's start with the pricing. So the Leica SL2 is currently advertised for about maybe a little more than $6,000. The SL2-S will go for about $4,800. So there is a $1,200 price differential between these two cameras. And depending on what type of shooter you are, you might be able to save that extra $1,200 and not go for the SL2, but go for the SL2 Speed. The first main difference between the two cameras is the type of the sensor built into the camera body. And the Leica SL2-S has a CMOS BSI sensor, and BSI stands for backside illuminated, and is supposed to catch better light, is supposed to perform better in low light environments, is very likely better for the night sky, and in this way is more sensitive to light. The SL2 still has a CMOS sensor, and the CMOS sensor is also with a much higher resolution. So on the Leica SL2-S you have 24 megapixels, which is the standard, for instance, for Sony A7 cameras if you don't go for the R series. And the Leica SL2 has 47 megapixels, that's well known. There are many videos on my channel on the Leica SL2, and you can look them up and get your own impressions what I think about this camera. It's one of my most favorite cameras actually I'm working with. Both cameras, by the way, have a color depth of 14 bits per RGB channel, and they also have high sensitivity on ISO, and we are going to look this up now in the menu and put these cameras side by side. Looking into ISO and taking the Leica SL2, I can go to the menu here and go into ISO settings, and then I see this starts at an ISO of 50, here's auto, and then I can scroll down to an ISO of 50,000, then it flips back to auto. So 50,000 is the maximum ISO I have on the Leica SL2. On the Leica SL2-S, if I go into the menu and go to ISO, I have auto 50, and then I can scroll down, I reach the 50,000, I get one more notch here, ISO 100,000 is the max on the Leica SL2-S. I already mentioned that the Leica SL2-S is probably the better choice for videographers compared to the Leica SL2. And there is a second application where this 24 megapixel backside illuminated CMOS sensor will shine, and that's sports and action photography. And actually, the frames per second you can take with that camera, that should be way superior to what you get on the Leica SL2. First of all, because you need less buffering. 24 megapixels compared to 47 megapixels, of course, needs much more time and capacity to buffer. And second, Leica optimized here the autofocus, Leica optimized here the buffering and the frame per second rate, and that clearly is the better choice for sports and action photographers. If you are a landscape photographer, very likely you will appreciate the high resolution here. In the same way, if you are someone who takes cityscapes and architecture, then this is probably the better choice, the classical SL2. For those of you who shoot action, sports and videos, the Leica SL2 Speed is very likely very interesting. Let's try the continuous shooting out for a moment. So I take one of my SD cards here out of the Leica SL2. So you see this is a very quick one here. So this has 300 megabyte per second. Let's get this into the Leica SL2-S and let's have a look how this works. So now let's tweak this camera a little bit. Let's go into menu, and first of all I want to look into shutter type, and shutter type is here of hybrid. I think that's the best standard for normal shooting conditions. Let's go back to the status screen and let's go from autofocus single, because I don't have a lens mounted here, and we are going to test the autofocus in more detail in another video. But let's go into manual focus for a moment just to get the sound of burst shooting here. Let's go from drive mode into continuous high speed, and on the shooting parameters I think that looks good. Let's see how this sounds and if I like that sound. And watch here the counter, of course. Now it stops. So I think this is impressive, and for sports and action photography, clearly something you will appreciate. And if you go from continuous high speed, let's go here, high speed, to the next one, very high speed, it will automatically switch to electronic shutter. And you can see this when you go into the shutter type now. You see the shutter type here, first line item is now grayed out. We choose hybrid before, but now we have it grayed out. We can no longer manipulate it, and the camera decides itself that it is time now for electronic shutter. And I want you to look now how much quicker this becomes here at your counter. Just have a look here. I tried to get this in the video here. See how quick this counts down. This is absolutely amazing, really amazing. And clearly the main question is, what frame rate per second do you get where your focus is still operating and tracking objects and images? And that's are things where I personally believe you should not look into the specs. You really need to try it out and need to get your own impressions, because not always the camera specs are really what the camera is delivering at the end of the day. Looking again into the specs as they come from Leica, both cameras have the same processor. So it's a Maestro 3 processor, but there are some differences in the way they process the images, because on the right hand side with the Leica SL2 we have 47 megapixels raw files, and here we have 24 megapixel raw files on the SL2S. And you see here in the specs that on the SL2 Speed You get 4 GB buffer memory, and you get image series with up to 25 DNG, means raw images per second, and an almost infinite image series in the JPEG format. Whereas here on the Leica SL2, it says 10 frames per second with the focal plane shutter and 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. And clearly, as I said before, if you have 47 megapixel to process in RAW versus 24 megapixel, you have a much harder time. That's why the 24 megapixel camera will always be better suited for sports and action. Looking again for a moment in the specs for the Leica SL2-S and putting it in perspective to the Leica SL2, we find the following: lots of similarities. Design is the same, they are both made in Germany, clearly it's Leica. Control and handling is the same, they have cine modes and 4K modes. I come back to this later. They both have a high resolution electronic viewfinder, it's 5.76 megapixels, and the quality of these viewfinders here is just fantastic. They have differences in the resolution, 24 versus 47 megapixels, but the smaller resolution sensor is backside illuminated, which helps you to catch more light and is actually the first of its kind in a Leica camera. They have the same processor, they can both shut remotely. We had a Leica Photos app, they have object detection autofocus, in-body stabilization, which gives you about 4 to 5 stops and helps you in low light environments. The multi-shot option is interesting. On the Leica SL2, it was announced from scratch, but we had to wait for many months until it was included in a firmware update. Now on the Leica SL2-S, it's there from scratch, and it has about half the resolution of what you get on the Leica SL2, 96 megapixels. But the thing is, on the Leica cameras, it really works. There are many cameras who claim to have multi-shot options, and very often you get artifacts and the image, when it is stacked, is not in the way you want to have it. On Leica cameras, it's working. There is a video on my channel with the Leica SL2 where I demonstrate it, and I can tell you the algorithm works. You need to be sure that you have it sturdy on a tripod. You need to make sure that your scene is still and not with moving objects. Then it's not working, of course, by construction, but it works much better than on most other cameras I've had in my hands. They are both very robust. They are dust and splash water resistant, and the industry standard attached to it is IP54. And you can use the full range of L-mount lenses, and with an adapter. That field here is filled in the spec sheet on the Leica SL2. You can also access the full range of M-mount lenses. The Leica SL2 is known to have a 5K video mode. If you go into the menu here, and let's go back to the status menu and swipe to get into video, then the background changes to white. That came with a firmware update not too long ago, that you get this indication by the background color. And then going into settings, and in settings going to video format and resolution, you always have MOV and MP4. And on MOV you can go up here to 5K for the video mode. And it gives you an aspect ratio of 4:3, and that's quite nice. So you really get here something to play with. On the Leica SL2-S, you don't have a 5K video mode, and you can see this here. I'm already here in video mode. Let's go into the video format and resolution, and if you go into MOV, it stops at cinematic 4K. So there is C4K, 4K and Full HD. There is no 5K mode, and if you download the manual of the SL2-S at Leica, then you will see that 5K is not foreseen for that camera here. Now, my Leica SL2-S here still has a pre-production firmware, and the final firmware is not yet available for download. I just checked this an hour ago. I nevertheless thought I should give you my first impressions, and should in particular give you a quick hands-on and show you that camera from the outside. As soon as the firmware is available, I will download it and install, and clearly the ones who get shipped to clients in the next couple of weeks, they will have the final firmware. But you can see the firmware basically going into the menu and then going into camera information. And if I do that here, you see there is a strange firmware numbering here of 0.1F, and that's clearly not the final firmware version. And that's the reason why I cannot demonstrate live the main distinction feature between this camera and the Leica SL2. And I will nevertheless explain what it is, and then hopefully in the next couple of days I get the new firmware on this one and can shoot it over the weekend when the Leica store in Zurich is giving this back to me Saturday evening. So what I wanted to show actually is, if we go into the video settings, you have the same setup as on the Leica SL2. You have video gamma, you can choose this to be off, HLG or L-Log, and in the settings on HLG you can tweak sharpness and saturation, and on L-Log you can tweak sharpness. There should be one more menu entry here, which I'm going to show now in the manual and quickly explain. And that menu entry is about LUT Profiles, and you see here that if you go into the video settings in the final firmware and you go to video gamma and to settings and you choose L-Log, then you should get another menu entry which is LUT Profiles. And LUT Profiles are basically lookup tables where you can transform color and tone, and it's very well known to professional videographers because they appreciate transforming a formerly flat profile then in the kind of, let's call it the atmosphere they want to have on the video. And in the final firmware, as the manual is indicating here, this will be all available, and there are 2 LUT profiles already in the firmware implemented if it is final, which will be a natural profile or a classic profile, and there are many more to come. So in the camera as it is right now, this is not yet visible because it's a pre-production firmware. If you go to L-Log and the settings, we only have the sharpness and not the LUT profile. I will conclude the video by showing the outlook Leica has provided already and made public on firmware releases in spring 2021. There are lots of new features coming to the SL2S. So new autofocus algorithm, HEVC video compression, you know, all kinds of things you can look up in the web. And Leica has a very good reputation and tradition in providing regular firmware updates. So there is much more to come on that Leica SL2S, which already I think provides a lot of interesting data points for people who are interested in videography and sports and action shooting. I will not do my usual walk through the menus here because essentially what I've seen in these few hours since I'm looking at that camera, it's getting actually close to midnight here in Switzerland now, is that this is in essence a Leica SL2 with a lower resolution sensor, 24 megapixels versus 47 megapixels, but with an additional feature that the sensor is backside illuminated, which should give you better performance in low light. The lower resolution is great for sports and action photography because you will need less capacity on buffering and therefore can be quicker, as I showed before. I hope you liked that little video, your first glimpse on the new Leica SL2S. And don't forget to drop me a thumbs up if you appreciated my work close before midnight, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I will look in more detail in that camera in the next days. As I said, the Leica store in Zurich will give it to me over the weekend when the store is closed. I hope I have the final firmware then on the camera, and until then, stay safe and healthy and peace out.